Have you ever noticed that the very traits you despise most in others are the ones that trigger you the deepest? That colleague who's always seeking attention, that friend who seems selfish, that stranger whose arrogance makes your blood boil. What if I told you that your intense reaction to these people isn't really about them at all? What if it's about something hidden within yourself that you refuse to acknowledge? Carl Jung, the revolutionary Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the depths of the human psyche, discovered something unsettling about human nature. He found that we don't just dislike certain behaviors in others, we actually project our own disowned psychological material onto them. Jung called this phenomenon shadow projection, and it's one of the most unconscious yet powerful forces shaping our relationships and our perception of reality. Today you're going to discover the 7 unmistakable signs that you're projecting your shadow onto others. These aren't just psychological concepts, they're mirrors reflecting the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, or buried so deep you've forgotten they exist. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand why certain people trigger you so intensely, and more importantly, you'll learn how to reclaim the disowned parts of yourself that have been hiding in plain sight. Jung believed that everything irritating about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But first, we must have the courage to look into the psychological mirror and see what we've been avoiding. Are you ready to meet the parts of yourself you've been projecting onto the world? The first sign that you're projecting your shadow is when you experience disproportionate emotional reactions to specific behaviors in others. Let me paint you a picture. Sarah works in a corporate office, and there's one colleague, Michael, who absolutely infuriates her. Every time Michael speaks up in meetings with what she perceives as arrogance, Sarah feels her chest tighten, her jaw clench, and an almost uncontrollable urge to challenge him. She finds herself thinking about these interactions hours later, replaying them in her mind, building elaborate arguments about why Michael is wrong. Now here's what Jung would say about Sarah's reaction. The intensity of her emotional response is completely out of proportion to the actual situation. Michael's behavior, while perhaps not ideal, doesn't warrant the psychological storm it creates within her. This disproportionate reaction is the first clue that Sarah isn't really seeing Michael clearly. She's seeing her own disowned shadow material projected onto him. You see, Jung discovered that we all have what he called a shadow self. This shadow contains all the parts of our personality that we've deemed unacceptable, usually based on our upbringing, cultural conditioning, and personal experiences. Sarah, perhaps, was raised in a family where speaking up confidently was labeled as showing off or being too big for your boots. To survive and be loved, she learned to suppress her own assertiveness, her own desire to be heard and recognized. But here's the psychological twist that Jung illuminated so brilliantly. The energy of those suppressed traits doesn't disappear. Instead, it gets projected outward onto others. When Sarah sees Michael being assertive, she's actually seeing her own buried assertiveness, but because she's rejected this part of herself, she experiences it as threatening and offensive when she encounters it in others. The consequence of this projection is profound. Sarah remains disconnected from her own power, her own voice, her own ability to confidently share her ideas. She's trapped in a prison of her own making, reacting to others instead of understanding herself. Meanwhile, Michael becomes a convenient scapegoat for all the assertiveness she's afraid to embody. The second sign of shadow projection is when you find yourself obsessively analyzing and criticizing the same behaviors across multiple people in your life. This isn't just about one person triggering you, it's about a pattern that follows you wherever you go. Consider David, a quiet, conscientious man who prides himself on being humble and modest. Everywhere David goes, he encounters people he labels as narcissistic. His boss is narcissistic because she takes credit for the team's work. His neighbor is narcissistic because he plays music too loudly. His brother-in-law is narcissistic because he posts too many photos on social media. David has become a detector of narcissism, finding it everywhere he looks. Jung would recognize this pattern immediately. When we're constantly seeing the same negative trait in multiple people across different contexts, we're likely projecting our own disowned shadow material. David's obsession with identifying narcissism in others reveals his own buried narcissistic impulses he's rejected so completely that he can't acknowledge their existence within himself. Perhaps David secretly craves recognition, admiration, and acknowledgement. Perhaps he fantasizes about being seen, appreciated, and celebrated for his achievements. But because he was taught that wanting attention is selfish and wrong, he's buried these natural human desires so deep that they've become shadow material. Now, whenever he encounters someone who expresses these qualities openly, he experiences them as threatening because they represent the parts of himself he's disowned. The psychological consequence here is that David remains stuck in false modesty and self-effacement. He's unable to advocate for himself, to celebrate his achievements, or to claim the recognition he deserves. His criticism of others' narcissism becomes a way of maintaining his own psychological prison, ensuring he never has to face his own buried desires for acknowledgement and appreciation. Jung taught us that what we resist persists. The more David fights against the narcissistic behavior he sees in others, the more disconnected he becomes from the healthy aspects of self-love and self-advocacy that every human being needs to thrive. The third sign emerges when you feel a compulsive need to fix, change, or educate certain people, especially when they haven't asked for your help. This missionary complex, as some psychologists call it, is often a projection of our own need for healing and transformation. Meet Lisa, a successful therapist who has dedicated her life to helping others overcome their emotional wounds. On the surface, this seems noble and admirable, but Lisa has a particular obsession with helping people she perceives as damaged or broken. She's drawn to friends with addiction issues, romantic partners with emotional unavailability, and family members with self-destructive patterns. She spends enormous amounts of energy trying to heal these people, often at the expense of her own well-being. What Lisa doesn't realize is that her compulsive need to fix others is a projection of her own unhealed wounds. Jung understood that we often become fixated on healing in others what we're afraid to heal in ourselves. Lisa's attraction to broken people isn't really about compassion. It's about unconsciously trying to heal her own brokenness through them. The shadow material Lisa is projecting contains her own feelings of being damaged, unworthy, and in need of rescue. But because she's built her identity around being the helper, the healer, the one who has it all together, she can't acknowledge her own wounds. Instead, she projects her need for healing onto others and attempts to heal herself vicariously through fixing them. The psychological consequence is devastating. Lisa remains disconnected from her own healing journey, exhausting herself in futile attempts to change people who haven't chosen to change. She attracts relationships that confirm her belief that she must earn love through service, keeping her trapped in patterns of codependency and emotional depletion. Jung recognized that true healing begins with owning our own wounds rather than projecting them onto others. Until Lisa can acknowledge her own brokenness with compassion, she'll continue to see the world as full of people who need her help, never realizing that the person who most needs her attention is herself. The fourth sign of shadow projection reveals itself through your social judgments and the stories you tell about different types of people. Pay attention to the categories of people you consistently criticize or feel superior to, because these judgments often reveal disowned aspects of your own psyche. Take Marcus, an intellectual who prides himself on his rational thinking and academic achievements. Marcus has nothing but contempt for what he calls shallow people, those who care about fashion, social media, celebrity culture, or material possessions. He sees them as vapid, superficial, and lacking in depth. At dinner parties, Marcus is quick to dismiss conversations about popular culture, steering discussions toward more meaningful topics like philosophy, science, or politics. But Jung would see through Marcus's intellectual superiority immediately. His harsh judgment of shallow people reveals his own disowned relationship with beauty, pleasure, and the sensual aspects of life. Marcus has likely rejected these qualities in himself, perhaps because he was taught that caring about appearance or material things was frivolous or beneath him. The shadow material Marcus is projecting contains his own desires for beauty, aesthetic pleasure, social connection, and yes, even superficial enjoyment. Deep down, part of him might want to care about how he looks, to enjoy popular culture, to participate in the lighter aspects of human experience, but because he's rejected these impulses as intellectually inferior, he projects them onto others and then judges those others harshly. This projection keeps Marcus disconnected from the full spectrum of human experience. He misses out on the joy, beauty, and simple pleasures that make life rich and textured. His relationships suffer because he can't connect with people who express the qualities he's disowned. He becomes rigid, intellectually arrogant, and ironically, quite shallow in his inability to appreciate the many dimensions of human nature. Jung taught that true wisdom involves integrating all aspects of the psyche, including the parts we consider beneath us. Until Marcus can embrace his own capacity for shallowness, he'll continue to see the world as divided between the enlightened few and the ignorant masses, never realizing that his judgment reveals more about his own psychological limitations than about the people he criticizes. The fifth sign appears when you consistently attract the same type of people into your life, especially people who embody traits you claim to dislike. This isn't coincidence, it's the unconscious magnetism of shadow projection, drawing to you exactly what you need to see about yourself. Consider Janet, who has a pattern of attracting selfish romantic partners. Every relationship follows the same script. She meets someone charming and caring, but gradually discovers they're self-centered, manipulative, and emotionally unavailable. Janet sees herself as generous, giving, and considerate, the complete opposite of the partners she attracts. She often wonders why she has such bad luck in love. Jung would explain Janet's pattern through the lens of shadow projection and psychological complementarity. We don't just project our shadow randomly. We're unconsciously drawn to people who can carry our disowned psychological material for us. Janet's attraction to selfish partners reveals her own disowned selfishness, her own buried needs and desires that she's learned to reject. Perhaps Janet was raised to believe that her own needs were less important than others. Perhaps she learned that love is earned through self-sacrifice and putting others first. To survive and be loved, she buried her own selfishness, her own capacity to prioritize her needs and desires. But this disowned energy doesn't disappear, it gets projected onto the partners she chooses. The cruel irony is that Janet's partners act out the selfishness she can't allow herself to express. They take care of their own needs first, set boundaries, prioritize their desires, exactly the behaviors Janet desperately needs to learn but can't acknowledge in herself. Her relationships become unconscious classrooms where she's forced to confront her own disowned selfishness through the mirror of her partner's behavior. The psychological consequence is that Janet remains trapped in patterns of self-sacrifice and martyrdom, attracting partners who will inevitably disappoint her because they embody the very qualities she needs to integrate. Until she can own her own capacity for healthy selfishness, for putting her needs first, setting boundaries, and prioritizing her well-being, she'll continue to project these qualities onto others, and then feel victimized by their behavior. Jung believed that our relationships are mirrors, reflecting our unconscious material back to us. Janet's selfish partners aren't accidents. They're her unconscious mind's way of forcing her to confront the parts of herself she's rejected. The very qualities that trigger her most in others are the qualities she most needs to reclaim within herself. Now, before we explore the final two signs, I want you to pause and consider something profound. If you've recognized yourself in any of these patterns, you're not broken or flawed, you're human. Jung taught us that shadow projection is a universal phenomenon, something every person on this planet engages in to some degree. The goal isn't to eliminate projection entirely, that's impossible, but to become conscious of it, to recognize when we're seeing our own disowned material reflected in others. The sixth sign of shadow projection manifests as an inability to see nuance or complexity in the people who trigger you most. When you're projecting your shadow, you tend to see others in black and white terms, as purely good or purely evil, with no middle ground or human complexity. Think about Rebecca, a perfectionist who works in quality control for a manufacturing company. Rebecca has identified a co-worker, Tom, whom she sees as completely lazy and irresponsible. In Rebecca's mind, Tom represents everything wrong with the modern work ethic. She notices every time he arrives a few minutes late, every casual conversation he has during work hours, every moment he appears to be relaxed rather than intensely focused. To Rebecca, Tom is lazy, period. She can't see any positive qualities in him, can't acknowledge that he might be competent in ways she doesn't recognize, can't imagine that his more relaxed approach to work might actually have benefits. Jung would recognize Rebecca's black and white perception as a classic sign of shadow projection. When we project our disowned material onto others, we lose the ability to see them as complex human beings with both positive and negative qualities. Instead, they become repositories for everything we've rejected about ourselves. Rebecca's harsh judgment of Tom's laziness reveals her own disowned relationship with rest, relaxation, and ease. Perhaps Rebecca was raised to believe that her worth was tied to her productivity, that rest was equivalent to laziness, that she must constantly prove herself through relentless effort. To survive and maintain her sense of self-worth, she buried her own need for rest, her own desire to approach life with more ease and less intensity. The shadow material Rebecca projects onto Tom contains her own longing for relaxation, her own need to slow down, her own capacity for a more balanced approach to work and life. But because she's rejected these qualities as unacceptable, she experiences them as threatening when she sees them in Tom. He becomes a symbol of everything she fears about herself, the possibility that she might be lazy, unproductive, or unworthy. This projection keeps Rebecca trapped in relentless perfectionism and workaholism. She's unable to rest without guilt, unable to enjoy leisure without feeling like she's wasting time, unable to find the balance that would actually make her more effective and fulfilled. Her criticism of Tom's laziness becomes a way of policing her own buried desires for ease and relaxation. Jung taught that when we can see only negative qualities in someone who triggers us, we're usually projecting our own disowned material onto them. True perception involves seeing the full complexity of others, acknowledging both their strengths and weaknesses, their light and their shadow. Until Rebecca can own her own capacity for laziness, for rest, for approaching life with less intensity, she'll continue to see Tom through the distorted lens of her own psychological projections. The seventh and most revealing sign of shadow projection is when you feel secretly satisfied or vindicated, when someone you dislike fails or suffers setbacks. This schadenfreude, this pleasure in others' misfortune, is often a sign that you're witnessing the consequences of behaviors you've disowned in yourself. Meet Robert, a humble, soft-spoken man who works in middle management. Robert has always prided himself on being modest and unassuming, never drawing attention to himself or claiming credit for achievements. There's a colleague in his department, Kevin, who Robert perceives as an arrogant show-off. Kevin speaks confidently in meetings, takes credit for his ideas, and isn't afraid to promote his accomplishments. Robert claims to dislike Kevin's arrogance, but he pays unusual attention to Kevin's career progress. When Kevin's ambitious project fails spectacularly, Robert feels a secret sense of satisfaction. When Kevin gets passed over for a promotion he was expecting, Robert experiences what he tells himself is righteous vindication. Pride comes before a fall, Robert thinks to himself, feeling morally superior. But Jung would see through Robert's moral superiority to the shadow material underneath. Robert's secret satisfaction in Kevin's failures reveals that he's projecting his own disowned ambition and self-promotion onto Kevin. The part of Robert that wants recognition, that craves advancement, that desires to be seen and appreciated, has been so thoroughly rejected that he can only experience these impulses through others. When Kevin fails, Robert feels vindicated, not because justice has been served, but because the failure confirms his unconscious belief that ambition and self-promotion lead to destruction. This allows Robert to maintain his psychological defense against his own buried ambitions. As long as ambitious people like Kevin ultimately fail, Robert can continue to justify his own self-effacement and avoid the risk of putting himself forward. The psychological consequence is that Robert remains stuck in mediocrity and invisibility. His disowned ambition continues to operate unconsciously, but instead of driving him toward achievement, it drives him toward resentment and secret satisfaction in others' failures. He becomes passive-aggressive, undermining ambitious colleagues subtly while maintaining his image as a humble, nice guy. Jung understood that our secret satisfactions reveal our shadow projections. When we feel pleased by others' misfortunes, we're often witnessing the punishment of qualities we've rejected in ourselves. Robert's satisfaction in Kevin's failures reveals his own buried relationship with ambition, success, and self-promotion. Until he can own these qualities consciously, he'll continue to project them onto others and then feel vindicated when those others suffer consequences for expressing what he cannot allow himself to express. This brings us to the most crucial revelation about shadow projection, the understanding that will transform how you see yourself and others forever. Every person who triggers you intensely, every behavior that makes your blood boil, every quality you judge harshly in others, all of these are invitations to reclaim disowned parts of yourself. Jung called this process shadow integration, and it's perhaps the most important psychological work any of us can do. When you recognize that your intense reactions to others are really reactions to disowned aspects of yourself, you have a choice. You can continue to project your shadow onto others, remaining unconscious and reactive, or you can use these triggers as doorways to self-discovery and integration. Imagine Sarah, whom we met at the beginning, finally understanding that her rage toward Michael's assertiveness is really about her own buried confidence. Instead of continuing to judge Michael, she begins to explore her own relationship with assertion. She starts speaking up in meetings, sharing her ideas, claiming space for herself. As she integrates her own assertiveness, her triggered reaction to Michael disappears. She can see him clearly now, without the distortion of projection, and often finds that he's not as arrogant as she once believed. Picture David recognizing that his obsession with others' narcissism reveals his own buried need for recognition. Instead of continuing to judge others for wanting attention, he begins to acknowledge his own desire to be seen and appreciated. He starts celebrating his achievements, sharing his successes, allowing himself to enjoy recognition. As he integrates his own healthy narcissism, his compulsive criticism of others dissolves. Envision Lisa understanding that her need to fix others is really about healing her own wounds. Instead of continuing to exhaust herself trying to save others, she turns her healing attention inward. She begins to tend to her own emotional needs, to acknowledge her own pain, to give herself the care and attention she's been giving to others. As she heals her own wounds, her compulsive need to rescue others transforms into genuine compassion that doesn't deplete her. This is the gift Jung offered to humanity, the understanding that our external world mirrors our internal world, that the people who trigger us most are our greatest teachers. That integration of our shadow leads to wholeness and authentic relationship with others. But shadow integration isn't just about personal healing, it's about transforming how we relate to the world. When you stop projecting your disowned material onto others, something miraculous happens. You begin to see people as they really are, complex human beings with both light and shadow, strengths and weaknesses, rather than repositories for your own psychological projections. Your relationships become authentic rather than reactive. Instead of being triggered by others' behaviors, you can respond from a place of consciousness and choice. You stop attracting the same problematic patterns because you're no longer unconsciously seeking people to carry your disowned material. You become genuinely compassionate because you recognize the universal human struggle with light and shadow. Most importantly, you reclaim your power. Every quality you've projected onto others and judged negatively contains energy, creativity, and life force that belongs to you. When you integrate your shadow, you don't become perfect, you become whole. You gain access to the full spectrum of human experience, the complete range of qualities that make you uniquely yourself. The arrogant part of you, when integrated, becomes healthy confidence. The selfish part of you becomes appropriate self-care and boundary setting. The lazy part of you becomes the ability to rest and find balance. The narcissistic part of you becomes healthy self-love and the ability to receive recognition. Every shadow quality, when consciously integrated, transforms into a gift. This is Jung's ultimate message about shadow projection. We don't become better people by rejecting parts of ourselves, but by integrating all parts of ourselves with consciousness and compassion. The goal isn't to eliminate your shadow, it's to befriend it, to understand it, to integrate it into your conscious personality so that it serves your growth rather than sabotaging your relationships. So I invite you to begin this sacred work of shadow integration. The next time someone triggers you intensely, pause and ask yourself what quality they're expressing that you might have disowned in yourself. When you find yourself judging others harshly, explore whether you're seeing your own rejected material reflected back to you. When you feel compulsively drawn to fix or change someone, consider whether you're trying to heal in them what needs healing in yourself. Remember, this work requires tremendous courage and compassion. You're not just reclaiming disowned parts of yourself, you're challenging everything you've been taught about who you should be and what makes you lovable. You're risking the discovery that you contain qualities you've spent a lifetime rejecting. But on the other side of this courage lies freedom, the freedom to be authentically yourself, to relate to others without projection, to access the full power and creativity of your complete psyche. Jung believed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not the sanitized version you think you should be, but the complete, complex, magnificently human being you actually are. Shadow projection keeps you fragmented, seeing parts of yourself as enemies in others. Shadow integration makes you whole, allowing you to embrace the full spectrum of your humanity with wisdom and compassion. The people who trigger you most aren't your enemies. They're your teachers, mirrors reflecting back the disowned treasures of your own psyche. The qualities you judge most harshly in others aren't signs of their moral failings, they're invitations to reclaim the rejected parts of yourself. Your shadow isn't your enemy, it's the key to your wholeness, waiting patiently for you to turn toward it with curiosity rather than condemnation. This is the profound gift of understanding shadow projection, the recognition that everything you need to become whole already exists within you. hidden in the very reactions and judgments you thought were about other people. Your triggers are treasure maps, your judgments are doorways, your projections are love letters from your disowned self, calling you home to the magnificent totality of who you are. The journey of integration never ends, but each step toward wholeness transforms not only your relationship with yourself, but your capacity to love and understand others. In reclaiming your shadow, you don't just heal yourself, you contribute to the healing of our collective human shadow, making the world a more conscious and compassionate place for all.